Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session of the Virtual Kant Congress. Today is a special session, so we're going to participate and listen to talks from a number of scholars in Africa, in particular from Sub-Saharan Africa. And the title of the session today is Kant and Philosophy in Africa. And before I hand over to the chair of today, I'd like to ask everyone if they want to keep on their cameras, because I think it's very nice if everyone can see each other during the talks. And I also wanted to mention that we normally keep open the Zoom meeting after the formal part, so that if you have questions or want to further contribute to the conversation, you can do so after the formal part. So now I'm very pleased to hand over the chairing to Lucy Allais. Please.
Thanks so much, Karen, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be having this session on Kant and philosophy in Africa. We've got at least 4 African countries represented: Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Cameroon. What we're going to do is all the speakers are they're going to speak roughly, basically just in the order that's on the program. They're each going to speak for between 10 and 15 minutes. And then we'll have discussion period. So the first talk will be by Tony Oyowe from the University of the Western Cape, who's going to talk about why the memory of Kant evokes traditions of thought from elsewhere. Then Motsamai Molefe from the University of South Africa is going to talk about human dignity and being in the world. Bernard Matalino from the University of Pretoria is going to talk about what could Kant mean for a Black African philosopher like me. Rodrigue Nzamayo from the University of Yaoundé is going to talk about Kant's philosophy between experience and speculation, challenges for philosophical practice in our time. Jess Lerm from the University of the Western Cape is going to talk about what can Kant learn from African philosophy. And Edwin Etiebo, my colleague from Wits University, is going to talk about Kant and the Academy in Africa. A couple of the speakers might have had problems joining, and if that happens, then we might shift the order just in order to accommodate who's already here. But we'll start with Tony. Take it away, Tony.
Thank you very much, Lucy. The title of my talk is Why the Memory of Kant Evokes Traditions of Thought from Elsewhere. I thought I should reflect on 2 items in Kant's biography that suggest that Kant seemed to have had a deep and abiding interest in other peoples and cultures, an interest in distant and unfamiliar peoples, but at the same time appeared to have stifled the development of that interest. And to put the point another way, I want to explain why I think that although Kant appeared to have exhibited that that deep level of human and intellectual interest in other people, non-European peoples, he equally seemed to have been committed at every turn, every opportunity he had to frustrate that interest. And he did that by erecting a wall, so to speak, that discourages interest in and much less engagement with other traditions of thought. But I also want to suggest that this tension or ambivalence in Kant offers us an opportunity to, for those of us who are thinking about Kant today, to begin to, in our engagement with Kant, evoke these other traditions of thought, traditions of thought other than the one in which Kant himself was epistemically rooted. The title of my talk, I should add, references the work of the Senegalese philosopher Bachir Diagne, who has written a lot about these traditions of thought and how to translate between them. One final point I hope to make at the end, if I have time, is to suggest that the dominant approach in the contemporary discourse on Kant and race runs the risk of passing up this opportunity. In some way, it begins to replicate the shortcoming in Kant, because it fails to engage with these other traditions of thought. I'm going to briefly clarify what that approach is about, and then say why it runs that risk. So a significant amount of work has already been done since attention was turned to interrogating the contrast between Kant's the universalist and Kant the racist. And part of that debate is centered around Kant's writing, motive in writing and producing work in geography and anthropology. Whereas the initial view, as most of us know, was that Kant's geography and anthropology is irrelevant or not that central to his metaphysics and ethics, with a resulting neglect for a long time. The facts point to their importance in Kant's body of work. So the first place to look for the ambivalence that I talked about between Kant, who seemed to be interested in other peoples and cultures, genuinely interested in other peoples and cultures on the one hand, and the Kant who appeared to be interested in frustrating the development of that interest, is in Kant's foray into teaching and writing about geography and anthropology. So we are told that Kant taught geography and anthropology a combined 77 times. That's more than he taught ethics or metaphysics, 46 and 54 times respectively. We are also told that he went out of his way to gain exemption from university regulations so as to be able to teach geography as opposed to cosmology. So that points to someone who's really genuinely interested in understanding other peoples and cultures. In addition to being a dedicated teacher of anthropology and geography, David Harvey has argued that Kant really believed that knowledge of anthropology and geography is essential in the sense of being foundational to all other knowledges. So in some way, Kant's foray into anthropology and geography appeared to have been motivated by an interest in interrogating a wide range of human experiences in order to ground or to find some kind of foundation for his metaphysics and ethics. Since for him, metaphysics and ethics must rest on a correct understanding of human experience. So this view appears to have prompted Kant's interest in other peoples. And to put it more in a different way, in order to develop his ethics, Kant needed to make sense of what it means to be human. And to do that means Kant needed to understand other peoples and cultures. But if this is the case, as Harvey has argued, then the system of racial hierarchy that Kant goes on to develop is not only unnecessary, but puzzling, since what Kant's system of racial hierarchy accomplished is that it erects a wall between Europe and the rest, Africa included, so that it becomes impossible for even Kant himself to get in touch with the other peoples and culture he initially set out to reach. And this is what Diagne, the Senegalese philosopher that I referenced earlier on, talks about in his work. This ability to be able to get in touch with people of other cultures and traditions is what he calls an ethical gesture on the part of the philosopher as a translator. And this is the shortcoming in Kant's work that I want to highlight. So part of the reason why the memory of Kant evokes traditions of thought from elsewhere is that he contributed in erecting this wall between the different traditions of thought by dividing up humanity on arbitrary grounds. But the other point that I want to highlight is that for us, those of us on the other side of the wall, whose features have been represented by the discourse in which Kant himself was a chief contributor, we have been represented as the 0 points of that discourse. We have no option but to evoke these other traditions because we cannot simply, according to Diagne, place ourselves in the discourse in which we have been so represented. And the only way we can engage with Kant, therefore, is to evoke those traditions that Kant placed on the other side of the wall, to use that reference. So that's the first point I wanted to highlight. The second item in Kant's biography that I wish to draw attention to is, as we all know, his choice to remain in Königsberg most, if not all, of his professional life, we are told. So according to Emmanuel Eze, Kant's choice was due primarily to his desire to stay in the seaport town in order to accumulate information about other peoples and other cultures, from travelers, from merchants, and explorers. Kant himself noted that the city is favored by its location for maritime commerce, and because of its seaport, it was an important place for Kant to be able to enlarge his knowledge of other peoples and cultures, according to Kant, even without travel. One more thing about that I think Isis mentions in his work is that Kant turned down several job offers from universities in other parts of Germany because he wanted to remain in Königsberg, and that allowed him the opportunity to get in touch without having to travel with diverse parts of the world. So here again, we have an image of Kant, who is, in virtue of this decision, revealing himself as deeply interested in other peoples and other cultures. As Catherine Flickschuh in her work describes it, someone who's interested in the culturally unfamiliar. And yet again, this interest is somehow undercut by Kant's own actions, this time due to Kant's heavy and exclusive reliance on secondhand information about other peoples, reports, travel stories, and all of that. So much has been written about Kant's use of these sources, especially Kant's uncritical attitude towards them. There have been also other accounts that suggest that Kant's attitude became critical later on. Says what was problematic about them is that Kant elevated these sources as providing accurate information for academic science. Others like Nikita Dhawan says it involved Kant simply recycling stereotypes and prejudices. But for my present aim, what I wanted to highlight, and what I think is deeply problematic about Kant's use and reliance of on these sources, is that the peoples about which Kant, peoples and cultures about which Kant writes about, they remain entirely invisible and passive in Kant's engagement or lack of with them. So at no point did they ever become Kant's interlocutors, for example, and that possibility never even occurred to Kant, it would seem. Instead, throughout, other peoples and cultures remained mere objects of philosophical analysis for Kant. So in many ways, that problem recalls what an African philosopher from Benin Republic, Pauline Otunji, noted many years ago as deeply problematic about Tempel's engagement with Bantu philosophy. And I want to quote Otunji very quickly here, because I think it captures the point I want to make very clearly. According to Otunji, and this is in respect to Bantu philosophy, ethno-philosophy, for those of us who are familiar with that discussion, Africans are, as usual, excluded from the discourse. And Bantu philosophy is a mere pretext for the learned disquisitions among Europeans. The Black man continues to be the very opposite of an interlocutor. He remains a topic, a voiceless face under a private investigation, an object to be defined and not the subject of a possible discourse. And I think this is what I find, I want to note as deeply problematic in Kant's use of those sources. So for me, the memory of Kant, that is the Kant that is both interested in other peoples and cultures, and the Kant who seem to frustrate that interest at every turn, is an opportunity for us to evoke these other traditions from elsewhere. And this means working towards dismantling the wall that between Europe and the rest that Kant, in his own work, seemed to have contributed towards erecting. But it also means that when we interrogate Kant in the present, we must do so in a way that allows those, as I said before, whose features have been represented as the 0 points of that discourse in which Kant was his chief contributor, that they have a voice or a say, a contribution to the larger questions of philosophy. Unfortunately, the dominant approach in the debate on Kant and race have revolved largely around making sense of Kant's thoughts. In other words, the terms of the debate have been structured around the question what did Kant think, as Charles Mills put it. And this is unfortunate because it is very difficult, on the one hand, to settle once and for all the question regarding what a historical thinker like Kant really thought. But also because the terms of the debate leaves its participants stuck somehow, I suppose figuratively, in Kant's head, thereby preventing the possibility of getting in touch with these other traditions that Kant himself appeared to have excluded from the beginning. So for us, and by us, I mean those of us on the other side of the wall that Kant contributed in erecting, what is at stake in these debates goes beyond Kant and what Kant really thought. It is, as Eze and Outlaw said many years ago, it's about the meaning of man, or the project of defining what it means to be human. Or, as I have tried to show in this short talk, as Diagne and Otunji seem to suggest, it is also about the meaning of philosophy, or what it means to think universally. So if we see it from this perspective, our engagement with Kant is an opportunity to engage with the larger questions of philosophy in a way that allows us to bring these other traditions of thought into conversation with each other and with Europe. I think that's a good place to stop.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. I'm not seeing Motsamai in the chat, in the among the speakers, among the people in the Zoom. So Motsamai, are you here? If not, maybe Motsamai is still joining and we can go on to Bernard Matalino. Bernard? Is Bernard ready?
Yes, yes.
Great. Do you mind skipping ahead of Matsamai?
No, it's fine. I was just writing a point I thought of just now. Thanks, Lucy. Greetings to all colleagues, old faces and new faces. I must apologize. My internet does funny things. Can you all see me clearly? Okay, thank you. My internet does funny things because Tony was freezing from time to time. I hope it will spare me that kind of embarrassment. But thanks for the invite. I will just say my presentation is guided by two questions, two major questions. And these questions have been posed really as questions without answers, firstly by Kwasi Wiredu and secondly by Emmanuel Chukwudi Eze. And the first question, which inspired then my title, is asked by Wiredu when he says, how then do you relate to these men who are well known for their racism, but also for their universal truths as an African philosopher? Of course, he asks that question in the light of the fact that as African philosophers, there is no serious heritage of philosophy on the continent, save for a few individuals who are mentioned in classical texts, particularly if you're from Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is what I am interested in. I think part of the invite stated clearly that we are allowed to state how we relate to Kant and how we came to know Kant. Actually, I wasn't taught much of Kant in my official philosophy training. I learned of Kant through a separate course that was ethics. And I took ethics as a filler course in second year. It was a first year course, really. But I had to pick up one extra subject at any level. And I took that course. And the only thing we learned about Kant was his categorical imperative. And if you do not know anything about his so-called racism and stuff like that, it's a very persuasive position. So it was juxtaposed alongside utilitarianism, virtue ethics. I didn't understand virtue ethics then properly, and I didn't understand Aristotle. I only understood Aristotle properly when I got to honors. But it was an easy deal for us. I must admit it was pretty much a mixed class made up of what we call Indians in South Africa and white people and black people. It was about a third of each racial population. And as students, we bought into Kant very easily. And we thought that the categorical imperative was sound reasoning. And I think this also applies to a whole lot of other things about him. I was also taught Hume at length, and I bought into Hume. I never found him troublesome. Then it was much later that I discovered that there was a troublesome aspect about these fellows. And then I immediately forgot all the things that were attractive about them, and I concentrated on the troublesome side. Maybe because I'm black, as Tony was saying. So it steals something from you when you read Hume's footnote, and then you later that he revised it. You later learn that he revised it to exclude all other races, and then keep black people as the downtrodden of truth. You sort of react to that. So in order to answer the question that I posed about Wiredu, I've asked myself another question: how can I map myself onto their world systems or on their world systems? As I dug deeper into this thing, I found that there are people who say these men could not have helped themselves because they were men of their times. And of course, that is rejected, and there is evidence that is brought to the fore of other men of their times who did not agree with their views, particularly when it comes to slavery, things like that. However, I want to ask, not ask, but as I think more about Kant, I think the proper inquiry of answering Redu's question must be carried out against Ise's two further questions. So Ise, in the essay that Tony cited, I think the title is Philosophy and the Man in the Humanities. It's a beautiful essay by Ise. I'm not too sure of the title, but I think that is the title. Maybe Tony can correct me. Philosophy and the Man in the Humanities, something like that. He asks the question, why were modern masters of philosophy so obsessed with the question of men, that question which they tackled extravagantly and tenaciously sometimes? Is it in discussing all these things by all these philosophers who are charged with racism, asks a number of questions, and he does not provide answers to those questions. But I've picked two, and I think these two questions are interesting. They're interesting now because of other things that I do as a philosopher, besides being fascinated by racist utterances by the great thinkers. They're interesting for me, at least, because of where Africa still stands today. So these men were thinking and writing at a time when they were in societies which were revolutionizing thought, and the revolutionary nature of that thought was that it was going to be objective, it was going to be science-based, and it was going to produce results. So there was a certain type of reason that was popularized. The first question is, was this convergence of the racist utterances by all these greats, was this convergence of truth or prejudice? That's what Ise asks, and he stops there. As a philosopher who is interested in Africa's perennial underdevelopment, if not complete degeneration, I'm fascinated by that question. Is it a convergence of truth or prejudice? And I think people of my skin color should take up that question seriously, because it could be dangerous for others, but it won't be dangerous for me. We should take that question seriously. And then the second question he asks is, what is the relationship between the darkness of the savage and reason and the light of reason, which of course Kant represents? Of course, he doesn't answer this, but you can see in his argument that he is trying to propose that there is indeed a relationship where, in order for reason to be pronounced so, it must have its own reverse, which is unreason. And that unreason must be presented in a particular format, which is best captured by the black race in the eyes of Kant and his friends. Whether that relationship sustains itself throughout history or not is another question, which leads me to the second question. And the second question now is asked by Emmanuel Ise himself, and he says, it does not matter whether these individuals were racist or not. But what matters is how Western philosophy has used race and to what ends. So 2 weeks ago, actually, we were talking about this article. I was teaching it to my students again. And one of my students, because there was a long list of the so-called racists, and one of the persons who was included there was Russell. And one of my students was deeply disturbed by this. He's a great student, first year, but you won't believe how much he reads and how much he knows. I jokingly say to a colleague, he can easily defeat some of our PhD candidates. He came to me and he was deeply troubled. He says, I know about these other guys, but Russell as well. And I must confess, I was caught flat-footed. I tried to think hard. What could I refer to him from Russell? I had to go and look it up, and there it was in his biography. And then Russell actually has said very strange things about Black people, saying their loyalty and affection is equivalent to that of a dog. The Negroes of America were harmless, and he didn't like white Americans, but he thought Black Americans were quite cool because they were so loyal, I don't know, to him, whatever they were being loyal about to him. What Russell, as a fairly modern man, fairly modern, as I would say, continues with this tradition, and he doesn't see any problem with it. But also, it doesn't matter whether Russell is personally racist or he was also just expressing prejudices of his time. If he were alive today, I don't think he would write like that. But the most important thing is, as Ise also says in another part, commitment to African philosophy is essentially a political project that the West has to take up. And I don't think it's a project that is only limited to philosophizing, but it is also a project that extends itself to how contours of humanity are defined, and they continue to play themselves out in a variety of ways and in a variety of institutions and in a variety of encounters, be it at the international level or bilateral level. To what degree can the African be successfully humanized as a modern human agent who probably is successful at participating fully and effectively at all the sorts of things that are required of the world that has evolved in the way that Hume, Kant, and their friends were beginning to see. And I think that is the crux of the matter. And for me, it's quite important that we take this issue up seriously. As Africans, we have witnessed increased repression, increased hostility, and increased desperation and despondency from within our borders, as opposed to threats that come from outside our borders. In fact, it has been very weird for me that today we talk about migration and its effects, and many Africans are giving up everything. I've mentioned this to Tony and Edwin before, and it's a new term I learned from Nigeria, spelled as J-A-P-A, Jakwa. Many Africans today do the Jakwa, which means just to leave the homeland and go to a foreign land, which we would want to think is the inhospitable home of all sorts of racism, but they can't stand the idea of being home, and they escape from home to go there. Why is that so? And we return to Ise's question: is this a convergence of prejudice or of truth? And these things worry me because one cannot hide from them. As much as, if we are in the court of the unpalatable stuff, as much as Kant and his friends say unpalatable things, there is also a certain dimension of unpalatableness that is issued by those against whom these things were said. I hope that makes sense. I've run out of things to say. Thank you. Nobody's stopping me. I have to stop myself.
That's great.
Thank you so much.
I'm still not seeing Motsumai. I know he was having a bit of difficulty getting in. So because I know she has to leave early, I'm going to move up Jessica Lerm from the University of the Western Cape.
Hello, everybody. Let's see if I can figure out how to share. I've got some slides prepared, mainly for me rather than for everybody else, though we will see a little argument. And I think it'll just be easiest if we can locate where in that argument I want to do some magic work. Can somebody give me a little thumbs up? Can you see the slides that I'm sharing? Thank you, Lucy. All right, so what I want to talk about today is what can Kant learn from African philosophy? And we originally had the subtitle and vice versa in brackets, but of course I've only got 10 or 15 minutes. So I don't know if we're going to get to the other side of the coin, but let's see what we can take out of African philosophy for Kant. So I see a few colleagues in the chat, a few names that I do recognize, but of course there are quite a few audience members that are unknown to me. So before we get going, let's just talk a little bit about what African philosophy actually is, just so that we're all on the same page. I don't know if everybody in the audience has heard of African philosophy before. So firstly and importantly, African philosophy is not just for Africans. That's not the idea. The idea is instead that it's a special kind of philosophy that originates in Africa, but certainly isn't restricted to Africa, that originates in Africa, largely Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's distinguished from other kinds of philosophies because it takes certain premises to be key that perhaps other philosophies overlook or play down or don't think are so important or even question. And the really kind of significant feature of African philosophy is this emphasis on the community. So we've got quite a few quotes here up on the screen. I think they're all saying largely the same thing. Maybe there are some differences between the claims here, but these are the sorts of things you see often cited when authors are trying to give an account of what African philosophy actually is. So first up, I am because we are. And since we are, therefore I am. Okay, so clearly that idea, that emphasis there on the community. If anybody's familiar with Descartes, you'll probably pick up that there's a kind of a little play on words here. This is intended as a parody. Instead of I think, therefore I am, the idea is that I am because we are. What gives me my being is not my kind of property of thinking or my rationality, as Kant would have it, but it is instead the fact that I'm embedded in some kind of community. A person is a person through other persons. A quote sometimes attributed to Desmond Tutu, but as I understand it, more like a sort of African proverb that Tutu in himself was referencing. And I think it's the same kind of idea. A person is a person through other persons. There's that strong emphasis there on interconnectedness and on community. It can be given different kinds of readings, stronger or weaker readings. Some theorists read it as making a purely sort of causal or contingent claim, a claim about how human beings tend to raise and tend to socialize other human beings. You might give it a much stronger reading. By the way, I prefer the stronger reading. I've had a little look at the other colleagues in the room and I realize I'm not in good company here. I'm the weird one. And I tend to read this as making quite a strong, even a constitutive claim. That a person is a person only because they are in a community of other persons. That's a thought we'll pick back up on later on. And then Menkiti famously kind of contrasting his African philosophy with Kant's, whereas most Western views of man abstract this or that feature, for instance, rationality, of the lone individual, and then proceed to make the defining or essential characteristic which entitles aspiring to the description man must have. The African view of man denies that persons can be defined by focusing on this or that physical or psychological characteristic of the lone individual. Rather, man is defined by reference to the environment community. Again, it's the same sort of idea, the strong emphasis on community. And then Desmond Tutu, who I mentioned just a few minutes ago, famous quotes, and I'll return to it later on. My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in theirs and other persons. We belong in a bundle of life. We say a person is a person through other people. It is not, I think, therefore I am, the quotation quote. It says rather, I am human because I belong. So a collection of quotes there from various prominent African theorists. sometimes being interpreted as making stronger or weaker claims, but almost always placing a strong emphasis on community. So what is really interesting about African philosophy and why I think it can do real work, as I'll explain later, is that at least on the strong reading of what constitutes a person, African philosophy is really flipping the script. And it's really kind of turning things on its head when we compare it to that traditional Western view. So Western philosophy, most people commonly assume that Western philosophy sort of begins with Descartes, and it begins with the I think, therefore I am. Bernard was talking a second ago about his undergraduate years. For my own part, that is exactly how my undergraduate education in philosophy started. It started with I think, therefore I am. And then we kind of meet these questions about, oh my goodness, so if I can establish, that I have existence as a thinking thing, then we got this problem of other minds. You really sort of look like the same kind of thing as me, but how can I be sure that you've got the same sort of vivid mental life that I do? All these sort of skeptical problems arise. In the moral arena, we see the problem of amoralism. So it seems to be quite clear how I can give myself reasons. For instance, if I want to get a degree, then I have a reason to study. If I'm going to get fit, I have a reason to take out a gym membership. If I have a reason to do this, that, or the, it seems quite clear I can give myself reasons. But then we're met with this kind of problem of amoralism. Why do other people owe me moral regard? It seems quite clear how I can give myself reasons, but how do I give reasons to other people to treat me right, to not kill me, to not rape me, to not murder, to not steal from, etc., etc. The problem of amoralism. How can it be the case that everybody is subject to the moral law? These are sort of skeptical problems that have really haunted Western philosophy and that have occupied me for many years too, particularly amoralism. So here's why I think African philosophy might have something really interesting to say, because it does flip the script in that interesting way. So because African philosophy does not commonly start with this idea of this kind of individual agent, but instead takes for granted that agents or persons are necessarily going to be embedded in communities. They're necessarily going to be in interpersonal relationships with others. In other words, moral relationships. A lot of those skeptical problems that had haunted Western philosophy are just going to fall away. Another significant feature of African philosophies is they take what we call an agent-centered rather than a patient-centered approach. So patient-centered, as the terminology suggests, focuses on how one can be treated. These are the kinds of questions that occupy us in Western philosophy. Questions like, are we allowed to abort fetuses? Questions like, are we allowed to euthanize the terminally ill, etc., etc.? How are we allowed to treat persons? On the other hand, African philosophies often focus not so much on how you can be treated, but instead on how you ought to treat others. It's almost as though they're looking in the opposite direction in some kind of sense, okay? What do I need to do to be a good moral agent? That is really the question that has occupied a lot of African philosophies. So as I said, it sort of flips the script in an important kind of way. I do just want to note that not all African philosophers agree on this, okay? African philosophy definitely isn't a sort of homogeneous lump of theorists who all say the same thing. There definitely is a lot of variation, a lot of disagreement, by the way, even amongst some of the people who are present in this chat. But I think that is a fair account of the kind of broad strokes of what makes African philosophy distinctive. One particular African philosophy is Equinobe. If we have time, but I don't think I will, we can talk more about Equinobe. But Equinobe, like many African philosophers, Bernard just mentioned Eze a few minutes ago, were very, very critical of Kant. So here's a quote from Equinobe. The Kantian view of the inherent worth and inalienability of individual autonomy that grounds most discussions about personhood and dignity is consistent with this Cartesian tradition. We were talking a second ago about this idea of I think, therefore I am, very individualistic. This view implies that individuals must be left alone to make their own choices and judgments. This view of autonomy is a negative sense of free will as a capacity. which involves non-interference by others or limitations by relationships or social norms, material goods, and options that a community provides. It denies in some form the relevance of communal values, relationships, and obligations that circumscribe or make options available for free choice. This negative view as a basis for dignity is implausible. Equinobe does not accept Kant's account of dignity because the autonomy to choose a life plan and how to use one's capacity to achieve such a plan are possible only because a community makes the proper effective means or options of material goods available. So first things first, we do have some serious Kant scholars in the room. So we might just want to flag that I think Equinobe has probably misrepresented Kant here. I don't believe that Kant offers us a purely negative account of autonomy. But here's the idea. This is the sort of thing about Kantian philosophy that has bothered African philosophers like, for instance, Equinobe. So how can we bring these two traditions together? Can we get one to talk to the other? Mutsamai Molefe, it looks like he's not going to be able to join us today. This is not a new thought. He's tried to do the same thing, develop what he calls a robust account of personhood, get these two traditions talking to each other. I'm going to try to do something similar, but in a very different way. What can Kant learn from African philosophy? Okay, so first things first, a little bit of Kant background, because of course we also have some colleagues here who might not be overly familiar with Kant. So, the transcendental deduction is what I'll be focusing on, coming out of the groundwork. And this is the idea that Kant can derive the moral law, the categorical imperative, from the hypothetical imperative only. So it's the idea that we can block amoralism, we can block the threat of skepticism that everybody is bound by the moral law, just by recognizing the fact that rational agents are bound by the hypothetical imperative. Kant wants to show that as soon as we recognize that anybody engaging in any kind of rational means and behaviors is necessarily also going to be bound by the moral law. And how that happens, how we get from A to B in that argument, is known as a transcendental deduction. Here's a quote from Korsgaard, and then we're going to break it down into some premises. So Korsgaard tells us, Korsgaard, a neo-Kantian, tells us that Kant saw that we take things to be important because they are important to us. We sort of imbue them with value, right? And he concluded that we must therefore take ourselves to be important, because we can give value or we can give normativity to certain kinds of actions. It shows that it's coming from us. In this way, the value of humanity itself is implicit in every human choice. If complete normative skepticism is to be avoided, if there is such a thing as a reason for action in the first place, then humanity as a source of all reasons and values must be valued for its own sake. The idea is that if I can give myself a reason, if I want to get a degree, then I ought to register. Okay, if I want to get fit, I ought to take out a gym membership. If I can give myself a reason, it shows that my humanity, my personhood is, to use Korsgaard's phrase, a source of normativity. And the idea is that it therefore shows that your personhood and your humanity is likewise a source of normativity. So this is a transcendental deduction following Korsgaard, following Wood. I am well aware that this is not without controversy. Lucy is smiling. So of course there are some Kant scholars in the room who read Kant quite differently, but bear with me until I can make my full point. So the idea is that this first premise number one, is just the hypothetical imperative. Okay, my desires for X obliges me, gives me a reason to take the means to X. That shows that normativity comes from me. It's not because God declared you must do X that you have a reason to do X. It is just the fact that I want to get fit that makes it the case that I ought to take out a gym membership. It is just the fact that I want to get the degree that makes it the case that I ought to register. The normativity, the normative force of that reason comes from me. So that shows us, number three, that my humanity is valuable. And as soon as you recognize that, you're merely being human is a source of value, of normative value. It follows that number four, humanity, generally speaking, is a source of normative value. My humanity is valuable. It follows, therefore, that your humanity is valuable. So it follows number 5, and number 5 is just a categorical imperative, that as I value my own humanity, I ought also to value yours. I ought to give you the same kind of moral consideration that I give myself. That is the transcendental deduction, at least as Korsgaard and Alan Wood read it. Here's the problem with that kind of transcendental deduction. Long quote from Korsgaard. Of course, I'm already running short of time. She's really just paraphrasing what we've just looked at, the argument, the transcendental deduction on the preceding slide. But even in Korsgaard's own kind of portrayal of this argument, yellow right at the bottom, we've got this awfully cryptic suggestion. So this puts you in moral territory, or at least it does so if valuing humanity in your own person rationally requires valuing it in the persons of others. There's a step here. There's some kind of logical leap that is not a pure deduction, and it's happening here. Can you see my red arrow between points number 3 and points number 4? So even if it is the case that the hypothetical imperative reveals to me that my humanity is normatively valuable, it seems to show only number 3 that it's normatively valuable for me. To get from this claim number 3, my humanity is valuable, to this claim that your humanity is valuable, requires some kind of extra argumentative step, maybe something like an analogy. But there is some kind of logical break here. So Peter Singer, I think, is this in my slide? There we go. So Peter Singer is quite bothered by this. Singer says that, well, actually, all the transcendental deduction shows us is that rational egoism is possible. He thinks the transcendental deduction, if I go back, ends, logically speaking, at premise number 3. All it shows is that my humanity is valuable to me, and at best, it might show that your humanity is valuable to you. Singer tells us it doesn't necessarily follow that your humanity is therefore valuable to me as well. So very serious. I tried to deal with this in different kinds of ways. Lucy says I'm out of time. So here's what I want to do. I want to insert an African premise. Why don't we insert into the transcendental deduction what I'll just call premise number 3b, okay? This idea that your humanity, this is to quote from Tutu, as we said, your humanity is inextricably bound up in mine and vice versa. Perhaps this is the additional premise that we need, not some kind of argument from analogy as other theorists have tried, but actually to focus instead just on what humanity is, on what personhood is. And if it turns out to be the case that that is necessarily intersubjective, or some theorists like to say second personal, then I think the rest of the transcendental deduction does follow through. Okay, I'm way out of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jess. We're going to move on to Motsamai Molefe from the University of South Africa. Motsamai, are you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you. Let me begin by apologizing for struggling to join in. I'm at a strategy session, so I had to, I was responsible for organizing it, so I was just caught up in that, and I couldn't find the link. I don't have much to say, but thanks for the little that I got, very profound. I realized how much of a Kant scholar I am not. That can be such a humbling experience, but I'm glad to be here. I want to really reflect, not so much on Kant, but maybe reflect on one of his most powerful ideas in moral philosophy, and the idea of human dignity. When you read the literature on human dignity, it's almost impossible, particularly from the Western tradition, it's almost impossible to find literature that does not cite him as foundational in it, particularly in modern moral philosophy. And what the idea that seems to come out in that particular tradition is just the idea that dignity is something that we have inherently. it's something that we have inherently, the idea of intrinsic dignity. That's a profound idea that's associated with Kant. And it's expressed in the second formula. And it's just the idea that we must treat another person as an end, never merely as a means, never merely as a means. I'm sure Kant scholars can go to town with that, dealing with the intricacies of that expression, both in German and in English. But for me, what really has resonated as a linguistic outsider is just the idea, capturing the idea that human beings have got value in and of themselves, And when you look at the influence of this idea, it's pervasive. If you look into jurisprudences of many countries, resonates on this particular idea, such a powerful idea. But so it's a concept that really captures us. But for me, another thing that really was bothering me is that we find ideas that are so powerful in philosophy, but when you come into the world, you find that they can't resonate in the world. And for me, is that disjuncture between philosophical concept and phenomenology, the lived experience of these concepts. And for me, this disjuncture reveals itself in two ways, particularly when I'm reflecting to this idea of being in the world. Right? Philosophers are trying to make sense of some of the most important things in the world. One of them is that they are valuable beings like ourselves, and these beings are inherently valuable. But when we look into our lived experience in the world, we live the world with a consciousness, with experience that says to us, we actually believe or actually live as if some people are not inherently valuable. In fact, we've got practices that suggest that. So at the conceptual level, we seem to have a particular ontological commitment. But at the phenomenological level, we seem to have a particular ontological commitment. So there seems to be a divide that is very fundamental. That our concepts, when you follow them through, they seem to create a particular kind of a world where maybe Kant can refer to it a kingdom of ends. But in terms of the lived experience, at least for some people, the ontology that it produced phenomenologically is completely different. It's a world of oppression, marginalization, and this reveals itself out even in Kant, the way he deals with the way he writes about non-whites, his anthropological analysis suggests that as much as he's committed to this powerful concept of intrinsic dignity, it is possible to have an experience such that in the world, when you look of other people, you look into their history, look into their culture, you come to not believe that they are intrinsically valuable. Right. So there's this disjuncture again between concept and phenomenology, lived experience. And it strikes me very hard there. And this is also very true also when you look at African philosophers. African philosophers who are working in political philosophy, they talk about this intrinsic value when they try to account for communitarianism. They seem to think that there's something special about us. But that kind of political philosophy for me is very hollow, because it does not talk about the lived experience of black-bodied human beings who in the world do not have the experience of being intrinsically valuable. They are treated not as ends, they're treated as means. So for me, it's that disjuncture that I'm struggling with. That I think it's important that we ask ourselves very deep questions about this gap between concepts and phenomenology. And I think one of the biggest blind spots, at least I want to make this commitment on the part of African philosophers. I won't comment much on Kant because I don't know much about him. It's what I call lack of sociological imagination, that our concepts are divorced from sociological imagination, that the social structures that shape how people live and experience their lives are absent when philosophers construct their concepts. Concepts of philosophers are not connected with the real world. They are stuck in their own heads. Many people, when you can tell them about this intrinsic value, women who are suffering from gender-based violence, the treatment of Africa in the United Nations, who has a right to the UN Security Council, who can veto, who has a right to have nuclear, when you look into that and you look for dignity, it's not a feature that regulates this relationship, even at the very structural level. Even at our personal lives, that experience of dignity is phenomenologically absent. It is something that's very, very strange for certain human beings, not just black-bodied human beings, but human beings of a variety of kinds that don't fall within particular sociological structures. So the question that I'm asking myself about African philosophy and also about Kantian scholarship is that how is it possible that our concept can be so sociologically bereft when we have such powerful concepts that do not reflect people's lived experiences? And by people here, I'm using a very generic term, and that's a struggle that I'm having. That's a struggle that I'm having with myself as I think about what I've read, a little that I've read of Kant, and some of the comments he's made about black-bodied human beings, but also what I've read from African philosophers and how they can be quiet about sociological imaginations. And I think a much more useful way, maybe that could really empower us as philosophers and philosophy, is think about how systems can really infect human beings to make them evil, to make them not to recognize other human beings. And it is these systems often that escape our attentions, and how our concepts that we are trained, that we use to navigate the world, seems to miss the very world that we are trying to navigate, the world that can infect us in the way that we are infected, so much that we can live in a world like this. So that's what I wanted to throw into this table. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matsumai. Our next speaker is joining us has had a computer difficulty, so he's joining us from Karen de Boer's computer. So welcome to Rodrigue Nzemayo from the University of Yaoundé. You need to unmute. There we go.
Hello, welcome. Thank you. I do apologize for joining later. I have some issues with my computer. My computer is frozen in Belgium. It is very cold now. So my title was to see how the philosophy of Kant to realize the way from the empirical to the speculations. But now I don't have my text in my eye, so I can start. I can say only just one thing that I came from to the philosophy of Kant in the high school, where I was a student in Cameroon. That was the study of the first the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals. So that was with all moral principles. So that later in Germany, where I do my PhD under the professorship of Professor Günther Zeller, I try to discuss on the structure of the critique of the pure reason. That means the methodological aspect and the theoretical aspect within the critique of the pure reason. That is not so important now, but what is important from my point of view now, it is how it is possible to read Kant today from the African point of view. That is perhaps that's the distance between the Europe from the 18th century and Africa, so that we cannot continue to read text, Kant text without this axiological neutrality. So we have to see how it is important to read Kant today. And my point of view, I think there are two attitudes. First, perhaps the reappropriation of the philosophy of Kant, and perhaps the revision too. But I'm not able now to discuss some theoretical aspect, because for me, the eternal legacy of Kant's philosophy, it is in the transcendental idealism. I think the transcendental idealism is one of the important points which is possible to establish bridge between cultures, because it is very, very important for us to see how Kant try from the aesthetic to develop some anthropological elements which are very, very relevant from our time. So I think the question of race, from colonialism, all those aspects in the philosophy Kant, I think they are not so important. But I think what concerned the race, Kant was, I think he was wrong in this aspect. He was wrong. But for the theoretical aspect, I think that is very, very important to see how the transcendental idealism can be possible. But now I don't have good elements to develop all those points, but one things can be possible. I think from the cosmopolitanism, it is also very, very important to see how Kant try from the transcendental idealism to develop some cosmopolitic citizenship. So I think that is what I can say now. But I'm very sorry because I cannot develop more. Perhaps I will try to send the paper later after, if I solve this problem, this issue with my computer. So that is, if somebody have any question, I'm very able to say one things or other things. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. We're all going for sort of more informal talks here anyway, so that's not having the formal paper isn't a problem. And so our final talk is going to be by my colleague Edwin Etiebo from the University of the Witwatersrand. Edwin, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, colleague, for joining in this, I think, important event. And I want to thank the previous speakers that have gone before me, and they have sort of laid some of the things I have in mind to speak to, so that sort of makes my job a bit easy. So I would hopefully finish as soon as I begin. All right. So as you know, the title of my presentation is Kant in the Academy in Africa. So why did I choose to speak on that? Well, I think the number of reasons, but one important reason, which I'll just say from the beginning, and then I will say a bit more later on, is the absence of Kant scholars, a lot of Kant scholars in Africa. So I will come to that in a moment. That sort of, especially in the academy, I mean, maybe there are Kant scholars outside the academy, which I don't know about, but within the academy, at least in Africa, there's a paucity of Kant scholars. All right, so let me really begin by one of my most the favorite philosopher for many reasons, but I disagree with him in a number of ways. Friedrich Nietzsche. Let me begin by getting to one important distinction he makes in his philosophical enterprise. So Nietzsche makes a distinction between what he calls philosophical liberal and the philosophical legislator, right? And he says that the philosophical legislator is a real philosopher. I mean, there are many reasons why he says that. We can discuss this in the Q&A. And then, curiously, he says that Kant is not a philosophical legislator, that Kant is a philosophical laborer. So by that implication, Nietzsche means Kant is not a real philosopher. Like, what? Why would you say so, right? Of course, it's banter back and forth. Has quite a lot of argument he makes. In fact, his book, Thoughts Zarathustra, was meant to develop this idea of the difference between a philosophical legislator and a philosophical laborer. All right, so I'm going to pick on that distinction again. Like I said, if we're interested in why he thinks Kant belongs to the category of philosophical laborer and not the philosophical legislator or the real philosopher, I'm happy to talk about this much later. So I'm going to pick on this distinction, between philosophical laborer and philosophical legislator. I would park that for now. I'll come back to that shortly. But let me just say a few things about what I think about Kant in terms of his contributions. Kant, whether you like him or not, Kant scholars, Kantians would can tell you a lot more. But whether you like Kant or not, there's no denying that Kant make many contributions to philosophy. Whether you disagree with him, whether you think he's wrong in X, Y, Z, which is perfectly fine. I'm sure Kant will be perfectly happy to say, yes, okay, maybe I'm wrong here. I can debate with you on that. I mean, that's what philosophy is. We're not... it's not a game of 2 plus 2 where the answer is just straightforward, right? There could be arguments for, against, and all that. So I'm sure Kant is perfectly happy that if you think that he's wrong or he has problems in some areas of racism and all that. But there are many contributions Kant has made to philosophy, and those contributions, even if they stimulate us to take a different position than Kant, at least that's a contribution. He has ignited in us. After all, Kant says that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. He doesn't have to agree with Hume, but at least Hume's contribution to Kant's philosophy is that without Hume, Kant will still be sleeping. In a sense, philosophically. So at least Hume made that contribution. So there are many ways in which you can make contributions to philosophy. You don't have to agree with the person's argument to say that's a contribution. Contributions don't always have to be positive in that sense, right? I want to just speak to 3 of those contributions that I want to highlight. 3 I think Kant has made to philosophy. And so one of them is Kant's philosophical delineation of the bounds of metaphysics. It's important. We see that, for example, started in the first critique, and we see that carried on in his later work, Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, right? Why is that important? It's important because prior to Kant, metaphysicians have gone haywire, and Kant said, hey, no, you guys are like crazy. You guys are all over the place, right? Let us see sense in which we can delimit the scope of metaphysical thinking. And that's important because doing that helps us to be able to separate metaphysical thinking from scientific thinking and from thoroughgoing empirical thinking. Because sometimes we mix all of this together. Sometimes we present metaphysical thinking as if they are empirical truth. We present them as scientific, so we need to really have that distinction. Very important. Give metaphysicians respect, but you give them respect if you properly delimit the scope away from other possible endeavors. And Kant was one of those that made that sort of contribution to philosophy with his first critique and his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And his other works, of course. The second is Kant's deontological ethical theory, which many people only know sometimes as a categorical imperative. For me, Kant's deontology provides a forceful alternative to consequentialism. It's important. At least when you have students exposed to ethical thinking, you have this sort of very different ways of thinking about our moral lives. And the very notion of that the good will is the only thing that is good without qualification. And our moral laws are constrained only insofar as they constitute bare respect for lawfulness. Namely, what it means by that is simply that moral laws are laws insofar as they are determined not by extraneous considerations. It's powerful, it's forceful. You may disagree with him, but there's something so intuitive about that idea. So the idea of acting for the sake of duty and what that would mean for our whole moral life. I mean, you might consider some aspects of that to be problematic, but at least that contribution is quite important. I mean, if you teach ethics, for example, and people talk about deontology, Kant's ethics is one form of deontology. There are other deontological ethical theory, the command theory. There's others that you can talk about. But hardly do anybody teach those as alternative to consequentialism. When you think ethics, usually when you teach utilitarianism as the most prominent form or species of consequentialism, usually the alternative people teach is Kantian ethics as the alternative. I mean, you can also teach contrarianism, which sometimes I do, but it's good to have to recognize Kant's contribution in that area. The third contribution is in epistemology, some of which may be problematic, maybe particularly his distinction, the analytic synthetic distinction, which people like Quine and the others have raised issues about. But his contribution in this area is important in the sense in which he makes us appreciate the importance of intuitions and concepts in knowledge acquisition. So the famous quote by Kant, "Thought without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind," becomes very instructive here, right? And of course, as we know, when you do epistemology, you're talking about the debate between rationalism and empiricism. Usually you see Kant as marrying both camps and bridging those camps, as saying, where you guys are right in some sense, you guys are right in some sense. You need intuitions, you need concepts, you need both of them, to interplay of them to be able to produce knowledge, right? So now that's a contribution that has stayed in epistemology ever since Kant, of course, made this. All right. Okay. So that's just out of the way, because I wanted to speak to that so that I'm not, it's not like just a conference of like criticizing Kant and say Kant is a bad guy, Kant is a, bad guy. Kant is, as an outstanding philosopher, whether you disagree with him or not, there's no doubt about that. I mean, these are some of his contributions. I'm sure Kantian scholars can realize more and more of other contributions in science, in philosophy of language, and all of that, right? So let me go back to the distinction I talked about between the philosophical liberal and the philosophical legislator, and the latter being the real philosophers, right? So we would then say that today, if we apply the distinction, the philosophical liberal in our context, in this context of the conference or in other contexts, would be people, maybe including me and others, who are not real Kant scholars, right? And the real Kant scholars would be the philosophical legislators, right? They really do the heavy Kant stuff. So, which is true, it's apparent in this conference that with the exception that all of us are not mainstream Kant scholars. We are, I say, Kant wannabe. We're interested in Kant, of talking about Kant and all of that. So the question for me, therefore, that I'm interested in is, why are there not many Kant legislators in the academy in Africa? That's the question I'm interested in, right? Why do we have more of the Kant philosophical liberals, people who can talk a bit about Kant here and there, but they are not, really, Kant scholars? And I'm not asking this question lightly, because it's something that I'm sure would have bothered Kantians or Kant legislators, real Kantian scholars, whether they work in Africa or they work outside Africa. And I'm sure you probably may be bothered, you may not be bothered. And And Lucy probably know about this because I'm sure there was you've asked around. There was one time you asked me about, oh, do I know of Kant? Does it work in Kant in Africa? And I drew blank, right? I couldn't. You asked Tad also. I'm sure Tad drew blank, right? And I asked, when you asked me, I asked other people who I know, and they drew blank, right? So if you say, give me 5 Kant scholars or 3 Kant scholars in the academy in Africa, you probably would draw blank. I'm not talking about Kant philosophical laborer now. Remember, I'm making a distinction that to say those ones you can find quite a bit of them. Maybe I'm one of them, Tony Oyowe, maybe one of them, Bernard, one of them, Musamai, and all of that. But those are not real Kant scholars. We're talking about Kant philosophical legislators, real Kant scholars, right? You draw blank if you want to talk about 3, and all that. You're the first one that asked me. I've had a lot of people ask me when I was the editor-in-chief of the South Africa Journal of Philosophy. We've had papers on Kant. We've had looking for reviewers. We go around the whole of Africa. It's difficult to find people, and all that. So you have to go outside and all that, right? But that wasn't even the first time that I got to sort of begin to think about the absence of Kant, so to speak, the absence of Kant. I mean, there's a presence of Kant in Africa, in the academy in Africa, but there's some kind of absence that I want to speak to in the academy that I've noticed over 10 years ago. So in 2014, when I was preparing for the conference, the first African Philosophy World Conference that we had at VITS, one of the topics we wanted to present as part of the plenary talk was, what is the state of African philosophy in philosophy departments in Africa? So myself and Jonathan Shemakona decided to do some kind of informal digging. So we contacted Department of Philosophies in many different parts of Africa to find out whether they teach African philosophy courses and which courses they teach. So we got prospectus, we got description of their courses that they teach for undergraduate and postgraduate. And there are hardly any Kant courses in this. We weren't looking for Kant, obviously, we're looking for African philosophy. But of course, that work provided me a glimpse into the courses that are taught in philosophy department across many universities in Africa, and there are hardly many Kant courses. In fact, I don't think maybe 1 or 2 I find that you find. And that corresponds with my experience when I was an undergraduate student. It corresponds with Bernard's experience when he was an undergraduate student, because he did say, for example, he never did any Kant course in the university because there's none. Right, that's the point, right. And when I was studying as a student at the University of Lagos, there was no course in African philosophy. University of Lagos is one of the biggest universities in Nigeria. There's none. But that does not, of course, mean that we did do some Kant, for example. So you find Kant in ethics, where you do consequentialism, deontology, you do a bit of Kant, categorical imperative. We did Kant in a course called philosophical anthropology, where we did a bit of Kant's anthropology. We did some Kant of course, in epistemology. There's no way you talk about rationalism, empiricism, without talking about Kant, But that's all you find Kant in. That's all, right? That's all. And so my point is that there's the absence of Kant scholarship, Kant scholars in Africa, but why is that so? Again, I don't have the answer. I can only speculate, and part of my speculation would be something like this. It is partly because of the absence of Kant courses, of course, in this department. We saw that quite clearly with the case of Rodrigue Zamenho, who did appear to do some Kant courses when he was in Cameroon. And you see how that interest was sustained, right? When he went to France to do further studies, he did do more a bit of Kant, right? So to borrow the language of Kant, the absence of Kant, of courses on Kant, prevent a cultivation. This is the language of Kant now. Prevent a cultivation for the grant, for the possibility, but not of freedom for Kant, of course. Kant was a freedom. It prevents the grant for the possibility, not for the development of freedom, but for the development of sustained interest in Kant that will enable one to become a Kantian legislator. That's my point, right? You know, because if you don't get exposed in the undergraduate studies to Kant significantly, to develop those interests, to go for further studies in master's or PhD, they know we're going to produce Kant scholar in the academy, right? So perhaps one of the lack of the reason why, maybe other reasons why there's not many Kant scholars in Africa, maybe due to that. But why are these courses not? There are no courses on Kant that will develop this interest. I'm asking the question. I don't have the answer. So if you ask me for the answer, I won't give you the answer. Final point I want to make quickly is that my journey is quite a bit different. My interest in Kant grew over the years. Not so much when I was in Nigeria because I didn't have Kant courses to develop this interest. But it was when I got to do my master's and PhD at the University of Alberta in Canada. That was the first time I did 2 Kant courses. Kant courses, and we had to read the first critique, part of the first critique, the second critique, and then in my comprehensive exams, I had 3 comprehensive exams. One of them, Lucy, you know a bit about this, which is gruesome. I mean, North American university system, comprehensive exams is one of the dreaded things there, right? You know, more dreaded than the coursework itself, right? You know, I did 3 for over a period of almost 2 years, and one of them that I did for almost 6 months was on history of modern philosophy. We did Kant, but of course Spinoza, Leibniz, Descartes, Hume, Berkeley, and the Kant portion that I did for that comprehensive exam, that was the very first time I had to read the entire critique, the first critique. I mean, it was difficult, you know. Of course, then I had secondary materials to look into. I read part of the second critique, then also religion beyond the bounds of mere reasons, as well as the prolegomena to inefficient metaphysics, right? So my knowledge of Kant, I published one of those papers that I wrote for the comprehensive exam, which was on the notion of substance between Kant, Descartes, and Leibniz, and that was what I published it from that. But my point is, my knowledge of Kant, my engagement with Kant, where I am now, is mainly because of my exposure in North America to Kant courses. That's my point, which is not available to students who are who may show interest in Kant and all that. Of course, at VIT, we do have a 3rd-year course where Lucy, of course, teaches Kant, usually in about history of philosophy, but that's because Lucy is an expert in Kant, so she can do that. But if you have a course in, I don't know, University of Nairobi, Kant, and there are no Kant scholars, we're going to teach it for you, for the students. Nobody's going to teach it, right? You know, so it's a problem if you think that Kant is not present enough in the academy in Africa. But if you feel, well, like, I mean, why should we be teaching Kant? Then you probably don't see it as a problem, you know. But yes, so that's the kind of my sort of giving you kind of a small snapshot of thinking about Kant in the academy in Africa.
Thanks, Edwin. So that was really quite an interesting variety of different things we've covered. And we've now got half an hour for comments, questions. People could make, like general discussion points and comments, or ask questions for particular speakers. And the first hand I saw was Rodica.
It is a difference between this session formed by speakers from different countries of Sub-Saharan Africa and in general other conferences of this other conferences. In which the speakers have discussed the reception of Kant in their countries, the problem of translation, But in this session, Kant appeared like a barrier against the customs of Africa. From this reason, Jessica told that African philosophy is for Africans. This is for the very beginning difference between Kant's philosophy, which is a philosophy for rational human being, appearing in the Enlightenment period, but actual even now, and the African philosophy conceived for Africans. What does it mean? In my opinion, the difference and the barrier, respectively barrier, is because the African people rejected Kant's rationalism or didn't understood this. And they are embedded in their traditions. But the item Jessica mentioned as specific for the African philosophy are interpersonal relationships against Kant's individual. But the individual has disposed of his own reason. And interpersonal relationship are not against, cannot stand against Kant's request in morals, for example, because this relationship has a moral target. Because in ethical maxim, we have to take Kant asked to take into consideration the other one, that interpersonal relationships are included in Kant's ethics. Then it's not, this is not, this first point, it's not specific, could not be specific for Kantian, for African philosophy. The second is, that categorical how to treat others. No, Jessica told this, how to treat others. That is to pay attention to the other one, that is also included in Kant's maxim. That is nothing, not specific to African philosophy, in my opinion. Well, maybe Jessica could explain this more. What is specific? Because these 2 points, the first and the second, are not specific in my opinion, but could be included in Kant's ethics.
Great. Well, let's let Jessica answer the question.
Hi, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I caught all of it. I was hearing some music in the background. It's also quite late outside. I've got 3 dogs desperate for their walk. So let me respond as well as I can. Just to be clear, I do not think that African philosophy is only for Africans. I definitely do not read it as some kind of relativism. African philosophy is a legitimate kind of philosophy, just as Kantian philosophy is, just as utilitarianism is, for instance. I myself am not African, although I'm born in Africa. And I think African philosophy has serious legitimacy, and we really should take it seriously and consider it a real contender to other kinds of traditional moral theories in particular. So you seem to be suggesting that Kant's ethics does cover consideration of the other. And I definitely think that is the case. But I think what we're really talking about here is at what level does that enter into the philosophy? And I think what theorists like, for instance, Singer, theorists like Darwell are quite worried about is that it seems to enter at quite a late stage of consideration. All the kind of rationalizing happens in the individual mind. And what I think African philosophy can bring to the table is that if we conceive of the person in a very different way, not as a purely rational agent, but as an agent in community with others, then we actually get the other entering into our ethical theory at a much earlier stage. Stephen Darwell gives what he calls a second personal reading of Kant's transcendental deduction. And he tries to do a similar kind of thing. He's not coming from an African philosophical tradition. He's instead actually appealing to Fichte, which is quite interesting. And he wants to say that very first, the starting point, even the hypothetical imperative, the idea that I can obligate myself, that I can give myself a reason, means that it must bring with it some sense of accountability. He says there is no such thing as obligation unless there is accountability, and gives a sort of long account of Western philosophy as to why this is the case, why obligation must necessarily bring accountability with it. And Darwell says, you see, this shows us that the second person, the other, the community, if you will, is actually already present right from step one of the transcendental deduction. If you think that you can obligate yourself, that means that there's some accountability. That means that the second person is already present. I don't think second personal accounts work, and I've done some work on that before. I won't go on much longer because I'm sure there are other questions. So there are definitely readings of, sorry, I'm not sure. It looks like Dira or Dyra is trying desperately to say something, but her hand isn't going up. We'll deal with you in a sec. So I think there definitely are readings of Kant that are much more charitable. I think Darwell gives us one. I'm not sure he's ultimately successful, but I do really hope there's at least room to have a conversation between traditional Kantian scholarship and African philosophy. There's been a lot of animosity over the years, and I hope we can get to a place where the two traditions can learn from each other.
Thanks, Jess. I've got three people in the
Okay, thank you.
got three people in the queue now, so apologies for my pronunciation. Ephraim.
Yes, thanks a lot for putting this together. It's been a wonderful session. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I have three questions for three different speakers. The first one is for, sorry if I mispronounced your name, it's Tony. So the first speaker, I would like to ask about the dismantling of the wall. And the question is, who do you think is incumbent upon to dismantle the wall? Is it only peripheral intellectuals or philosophers, or is it a more comprehensive task? And the other question about that is it with what tools should we dismantle? And here is another question: who's the we? Right? I include myself in that, but that's another matter. What tools do you think are useful? So this is a very general question. The other question is about the premise, Jessica Lerm, about the premise that you want to introduce in the argument, from my humanity to your humanity. And so I just wonder if it's already too much to concede to start by, or to say that this premise would involve personal or rather individual humanity. So here, what I'm trying to press is the point about the belonging, the importance of belonging, what you mentioned about African philosophy, right? So is humanity a feature of individuals, or is humanity a feature of communities? So this would be my question to you. And lastly, about Edwin, about the distinction between the philosophical laborer and the philosophical legislator. So it connects with the first question, the first question that I raised. And so I wonder, where would people like me fit in that scheme? Because I don't consider myself, I sort of became a Kant scholar, but I'm not interested in having conversations with mainstream and for people working on the other side of the wall, so to speak. So if I'm a Kant scholar, then I'm a philosophical legislator. But how about what people consider themselves to be? So in my own case, I consider myself a laborer and not a legislator. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just to intervene, there is a follow-up question to Jessica to what the previous speaker said. Can I just get crash, so to speak?
Go ahead.
Yes. Jessica's topic, talking about the African humanity, which focus on the collectivity or communal, there's this collective or communal focus. It appears to me that it is your argument to say that the focus on the collectivity or communality is at the expense of the individuality. I really do not think that in the conceptualization of collectivity or communal in Africa, even does discount individuality, because before you have a community, you have an individual. So it does not necessarily mean that the individuality is discounted. Perhaps now the question will be, which one is more important than the other? What should be the focus? But strictly speaking, I think in terms of humanity, whatever somebody said, the dignity, they are of equal force. Perhaps it might be when you are going to come to utilitarian and consequentialism in practice, perhaps whatever the practice might mean, that maybe the virtues of communal will be then. Because the virtues of communal are derived from individuality and they apply to individuality. So I really don't know whether you really can make that distinctions, and how far can you go with that argument. Thank you.
So a couple of questions there for Jess, but also for Tony. Jess, I don't know if you want to go quickly, and then let Tony come in.
Okay, no thinking time for me. So thanks a lot. Ephraim, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, wanted to ask me, is humanity a feature of the individual or of the community? And I said up front that I take the quite weird, quite strong, constitutive reading. Dira, you're not going to like this either, I'm afraid, of the African communal claim. I read it as saying that persons are social constructs, literally social constructs. They can only exist in society or in community, if you want to put it that way. I think you can, those shaking heads, I think you can conceive of an individual human body all on its own, just fine. But I think if we accept, which I do, that a person is a moral agent, I think morality itself is also a social construct. I think it only arises in community. And so I am happy to accept the claim. There's good evidence in this for Minkiti as well. For reading Minkiti is making this strong constitutive claim of what a person is, that humanity is a feature, or I would want to say person, okay, because human is really a biological concept. I want to say that personhood, if you read that as a moral term, forensic term in Locke's terminology, right? It can only exist in community because it's a social construct. So I think I answered two questions in one there, because they were really picking up the same difficulty, but I just have to bite the bullet. That is the weird view that I hold.
You did answer two in one. Thanks, Jess. Tony, did you have anything to say about the wall and the thoughts about that?
The wall. I suppose part of the point I wanted to capture, thank you for the question, by the way. Part of the point I wanted to capture, I suppose, is echoed in the talk by Edwin as well. There is a certain difficulty for those of us who are, as I said in my talk, have been represented as the 0 point of Western philosophy, given the history of entering into that discourse. And I wanted to capture the sense in which there's some kind of a lack of speaking to each other between these traditions. Many Kantian scholars, the legislators, according to Edwin, the real Kantian scholars will probably struggle to know some of the names I mentioned in my talk, Otunji, Bachadiagne, I don't know. And I think that it's that lack of conversation between the traditions, which I think many of the talks today have tried to bridge, that I was referring to when I talk about the wall. Who should bridge that wall? Who should dismantle the wall? Well, I think the work needs to begin among philosophers in the first place, because this is where Kant's influence is mostly felt. And I think it's in having those conversations across traditions that we begin to dismantle the wall. Sessions like this, for example, I'm happy to be invited to a session like this, but this is probably the first one in, this is certainly the first one I've been part of, where conversations between people from these different traditions can be had, and we can hear about thinkers from these other traditions that I think Kant genuinely wanted to get in touch with, but somehow could not. So that's that's how it makes sense of the point. It's a collective effort. Most of the times also, as some of the speakers echoed, we are trained within we study philosophers from Europe and North America. It's not usually the same experience, I suspect, for people who study philosophy in those places, to learn about African philosophers and thinkers as well. And the more of that kind of improvement we see in the curriculum that side, perhaps we would also be able to bridge the gap. But it's not an insurmountable gap. I was just trying to capture the sense that there's a lack of conversation between the two.
Thanks, Tony. And then there was also a question to Edwin from the last question. Edwin, can you be quick? Because then we've got 2 more comments or questions.
Good, thanks. Thanks, Ocha, for the question. Just before I really jump to the question, just to piggyback on what Tony was talking about, the war, I think it's important. Yes, of course, there has to be this dialogue, this forum where you have different traditions, philosophies being brought together. Expecting this is probably the first, maybe I can remember, conference that philosophers from Africa would be speaking in relation to Kant, and all that. We haven't had that. And to be able to sort of then dismantle the wall would first of all require an acceptance of whether there are philosophies or the other traditional philosophies are equally legitimate, and that will require quite a bit of our colleagues in probably Europe and North America or elsewhere to dissuade themselves of this idea of the triumphal narrative of Western philosophy, right? Once you have this idea that they just philosophy and it's Western traditional philosophy, then the point of trying to even have a dialogue with African philosophy or African philosophers, Chinese philosophers, and all that, it will not even happen in the first place anyway, right? So there has to be that sort of openness for that. So I wanted to speak to that, partly because Osha did suggest that, of course, my question is related to the question of the war itself, right? So that to the specific to the question of where you fit in, Osha. Yeah, I think you got me there, because the question is, what about if I don't want to call myself a philosophical legislator, right? So will you force me there? I'm only using the term to mean that anyone who has sufficient competency and expertise in Kant scholar, whether they work in silo or alone, or whether they work with other groups, once you have some training in Kantian scholarship and you are able to do some work in Kantian scholarship that reflects the level of competency and expertise, you are a philosophical legislator in that sense. And that would be different from somebody who is a commentator who comments on Kant, who has no competency, that level of competency, or doesn't have the expertise, either because they're not trained in Kantian scholarship or they lost that training they had in Kantian scholarship. And there will be, of course, different degrees. So among Kantian experts or those who have competency in Kantian scholarship, there are different degrees. Some probably know it better than some. Some perhaps are upper in the ladder because they have shown to understand Kant better than others. There will be different degrees. There will be people in the spectrum. The same with philosophical laborers, Kant philosophical laborers. There will be different degrees. Some people probably know Kant a bit better or more than some others, partly again because of their history, their training, whatever that is and all that. And the reason why I find that important is because sometimes it's not just for this conference, it's sometimes it's important for people to really have a disclaimer to say, look, I am not a Kantian legislator, right? You know, so I'm not going to speak to all the very nice things about Kant, but I'm coming to Kant here via what I have read or know about him, which may be right or wrong. I mean, it's a level of humility, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can't be an expert or competent in every philosophical traditions or every philosopher that there is. So, but I'm happy if you think there's a third category we can include there that fits your own sense of yourself as a Kant scholar. I'm not using the distinction to sort of box people in those two categories and say you must be here whether you like it or not. I'm just using it to signpost the idea that at least you can think about people who approach Kant from at least two points of view.
Great.
It could
Thanks,
be a third
Edwin.
category. Yes.
So I've got a hand from Rodrigue, but before that, I just also want to read out a question in the chat from Ulrika saying she wants to ask any of the speakers to comment on the relationship between Kant's lectures on physical geography and anthropology and the cosmopolitanism strongly expressed in Toward Perpetual Peace. Would the world shift when considering the latter text? So I'm just throwing that out there for everyone to think about whether you have any responses to while Rodriguez is making his point or asking his question.
Thank you very much. I just want to say something to reply what Erwin said. He asks why Kant is not so present in the African philosophical scholarship. I think we have to distinguish. There are the English-speaking countries in Africa and French-speaking countries. In the French-speaking countries, in Cameroon, for example, we are teaching Kant. Kant is very, very present in the philosophical curricula. The structure of the curricula also in the high school are very, very Kantian. For example, I am department chair of philosophy at the Higher Teachers Training College, and we are preparing a student to teach philosophy in the high school, and we have many courses, but there is not something formal or academic. But in Cameroon, for example, the African philosophy is a part of the world philosophy. That means we don't have courses specifically for African philosophy. Africa philosophy is teaching in the history of philosophy. That it was we are doing right now in Cameroon. So I think the Kant can be absent, could be absent in the lessons, but in the way we are teaching philosophy, I think there are many elements of the Kantian philosophy which are relevant, but not so formal. Though in Cameroon, in Ivory Coast, in Senegal, with this tradition from France, I think there are many elements of the Kantian philosophy in the courses. This is what I just want to add for what Edwin said. And the question on community and the collectivity in the Kant perspective, I think it is very, very difficult from my point of view. I think Kant is not the really partner in discussion with what African understand like humankind. I think Hegel or Fichte are the best partner in this because in the Kant philosophy, we don't have this kind of deduction of the external world, this kind of what we say the intersubjectivity. So I just want to add in this discussion, it is very, very difficult to integrate to Kant, to involve Kant in this kind of discussion between the African conceptions of the person and the Kantian. I think Fichte will be the good partner or Hegel in this perspective. So that is what I just want to add.
Thanks so much for that, Rodrigue. Good also to be reminded of differences between Anglophone and Francophone Africa. Since Ulrika also posed a question to me, I think I will just very briefly comment that I think Pauline Kleingeld and others have written a lot about how, you know, the cosmopolitanism in the later political philosophy might impact our understanding of various parts of Kant's racism. But in terms of how that affects the wall, you know, it might affect Kant's views, but there was also the issue Tony was raising about not remaining stuck in Kant's head, and whether overcoming the wall involves not just understanding how Kant's views shift, but not only theorizing from the point of view of Kant writing about other people, but without taking into account reading their views and voices. So maybe that would also be important to bring into the conversation on that. I think maybe Edwin wanted to, I'm guessing from his being unmuted, to say something about in response to Rodrigue's comment. Is that it right,
Yes.
Edwin?
Quickly, yes, no. Yes, Rodrigue, you're right. We the work wasn't just focused on Anglophone. The work was we did reach out to fact our point of contact for the Francophone was Paulo Tonji when he was alive. Then he was the one that gave us material for the universities in Benin, in Cote d'Ivoire, and a part of Senegal. So as you did, my remark was very clear, was to say, there are not many Kant courses in philosophy department. I didn't say there are not any. I didn't. And I did even mention that in case of you, it is because you were exposed to Kant philosophy early on in Cameroon that enabled you to be able to go to further studies to now begin to pursue the interest in Kant. So I have the data. So even we did do a bit of Cameroon. I think the person who gave us the material in Cameroon was what's his name now? I can't remember his name now. So, but my point is simply that it is the way they are structured, the way the courses are structured, the way they are. I'm not talking about teaching early Kant, say in high school, for example. I mean, if Kant is difficult for university students to understand, I imagine how much difficult it will be for secondary school students or high school students, for example, right? You know, so I'm talking about, I mean, me as an example, if I didn't go to Canada to go and do 2 courses, separate courses on Kant, we're not talking about teaching ethics and having Kant there, or teaching epistemology and having Kant there. I did all of that in the University of Lagos, and I'm sure some of my colleagues also in the Francophone or Lusophone did a bit of that. But we're talking about having like a Kant course, for example, where you read literally the Critique of Pure Reason or the Second Critique or whatever it is you read, first text of Kant, that then really gets your interest whetted and all that. You don't have many university philosophy departments in universities in Africa that teach a lot of those, and there could be historical reasons. There are not many Kant courses. Could be there's just so many courses you can teach anyway, or whatever they are. But that's what my little study revealed, that there are not many Kant courses, whether in the Francophone, Lusophone, or in the Anglophone.
Great. Thanks, Edwin. So there's different discussions about what's being taught across the continent, obviously a large continent. I think we've had a very interesting reflections from Bernard on personal experiences of first coming across philosophers and some of their other ideas and then coming across their racism. I thought very interesting comments from Matsamai about the difference between powerful sounding concepts that don't seem to speak to actual lived experience. He said our concepts are powerful but sociologically bereft, and we need to understand how the systems we live in can infect us to take us so far away from these powerful concepts. And I took him to be aiming that both at Kantian accounts of dignity, but also at African communitarianism. Interesting discussion about why there are not many Kantians in the academy in Africa. Interesting comments from Jess about whether a Kantian interpersonal account of personhood might help account of the proving the moral law. And really interesting comments from Tony, I think, about the importance of reading in different traditions, including in not just getting stuck in Kant's head. We have maybe 5 more minutes because we started a bit late if anybody wants to make a final comment. But I think that's been a really rich and interesting session. And thanks very much to all the speakers who I think really made great contributions. We really appreciate it.
So Lucy, thanks. And I, for my part, also wanted to thank everyone, all the speakers and everyone who participated. I thought it was a very interesting session. And I think that we also have made or taken steps toward breaking down a wall, and maybe various walls. And I hope that this event will also lead to further reflections and further dialogues across a number of walls, so that we can share what we value in Kant's philosophy, but also in philosophy more generally. So thanks everyone. Before we stop the recording, I would also like to mention our next session, which is on November 20, and will be hosted by the Immanuel Kant Society in Ukraine. So I hope that that you'll be able to join that session or one of the upcoming session. And I put the link to the program in the chat. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank you, Lucy, for organizing. Thank you, friends.
Thank you.